Okay, so buckle your seatbelts because this is a pretty big topic we've got here. Carrying capacity, population growth, and resource availability is a pretty important one for this particular unit. So here we go. Essentially, there's four things that can cause a change in an organism's population. Uh, Basically, there's things that can make it go up and things that can make it go down. The two things that can make it go up are births. So the more births there are, the faster the organisms are being born, the birth rate, that makes it go up. And there's immigration, the rate at which organisms move in and join the population from outside the population. Say we're talking about an island population, how many birds come to that island. Then there's the two things that can make it go down. There's death rate. The more organisms that die each year, the smaller the population is going to be. And then there's emigration, the rate at which the organisms leave the population. So we're talking about bird populations on an island. How many birds fly away from the island? So basically, birth rate and immigration make the population go, whereas it make the population go up. And then death rate and immigration make it go down. Biotic potential is a word we're going to be using a bit. So biotic potential is essentially it is the maximum rate at which a species can increase its population. So it's maximum reproductive rate under perfect conditions. So we're saying like, let's just say there's no predators, there's no disease, there's unlimited food. What's the fastest that you can make new members of your population? So we often express biotic potential in terms of percent per time period. So like these bacteria can increase at a rate of 5% per day, or maybe we talk about it in terms of doubling time. This bird population has a biotic potential of a doubling time of 3 years. Okay, so the main things that are going to determine biotic potential, though, are the rate at which reproduction can occur, how long it takes, and how many offsprings are born per reproductive cycle, because this varies quite a bit among species. So let's just look at a couple mammal species here. So let's start with humans. Humans have a very low biotic potential, and that's because it takes 9 months minimum gestation. And typically a woman's going to have only one child in that time period. So basically we can make about one baby per year, maybe a little bit faster if we really work at it, but that's it. Rabbits, on the other hand, another mammal species, much higher biotic potential because they can have babies almost once a month. And when they have babies, they can have up to 14 of them at a time. So if you just, over the course of 1 year, a human has one baby, and a rabbit can have, basically 144 or more, right? So it's much higher biotic potential. Now, when populations are growing at or near their biotic potential, what we see is an exponential rate of growth. And that's because the rate at which it increases is remaining constant, so that biotic potential is staying the same, but the number of individuals is going up. So if I say double every 2 years, but each year I have twice as many, the rate of the growth is going to be quite rapid. And so we see as we get this J-shaped curve, that's emblematic of exponential growth. So when we see this, we know that there isn't much limiting the organism from growing at its biotic potential. Now, the rate at which a population actually grows, though, does depend on other things. And the main thing is resource availability. I mean, there's other things too, but resource ability can never do that. So let's just say that we have more resources suddenly become available, like we have here. So we have an organism growing, and then it starts to level off for reasons we'll talk about soon, like resources became limited. But then what happens, we added resource, in this case phosphate, to aquatic organism's environment, and suddenly it can grow faster again, so it goes back up. So what we find is that the growth rate is something that is dependent on factors other than biotic potential. So if there's an availability of resource, or if there is an unavailability of resource, or a predator or a disease, that can also affect the rate of growth of the population. So if you take a resource away, you should expect that there's going to be a less fecundity. That means there's going to be less babies being born, or there's going to be a higher death rate. And as a result, we expect our populations to diminish. So let's just say there's a bird species that makes a nest in a particular kind of tree. Well, let's just say that tree now becomes infested with a particular type of of invasive species, and those trees all fall down, or people want to chop them down. For whatever reason, those trees become less available. Well, then that bird is less able to reproduce, so its birth rate is going to go down. It has less fecundity, and as a result, we see a diminishment in its population, or negative growth rate. Now, we're getting to what really matters here. Turns out that in the real world, organisms simply cannot continue to grow at their biotic potential. If they did, so for instance, back to the rabbits, if you just start off with 2 rabbits, within a decade, you wouldn't be able to take a step in career without stepping on a bunch of rabbits. I mean, like, that's what would happen. Clearly, that doesn't happen, but that's what would happen if rabbits could just continue to reproduce at their biotic potential. But instead, what happens is, as a population grows, the organisms start to consume resources. They start to occupy this. That could be amount of space. That could be availability of nesting areas. It could be food, which is a common one. And as that happens, it increases the death rate and it reduces the birth rate or the fecundity of the species because they're just under stress. And so what we find is we invariably get curves that look more like this. And this is called a logistic curve. So it starts off exponential, the organism growing at close to its biotic potential, but then it will level off here. And that's because of what we call density-dependent factors. In other words, that means the more of the organisms there are, the more that factor is going to become an issue for that organism's continued population growth. Let's take a look at these density-dependent factors. So basically, density-dependent factors are going to slow the rate of growth because of how large the population is. So that's why it's called density dependent. So basically, as the population gets bigger, there's more competition for food, for shelter. If you're a plant, there's shade is a problem. There's more waste materials around. There's more fighting between the animals. There's more parasitism and disease. And so basically, all these things have a tendency to increase death rate and decrease birth rate and cause the population to stop growing. So the density-dependent factors typically are competition for food and mates, disease, parasitism, which is, I guess, a kind of disease, the accumulation of waste that's often true in aquatic organisms, increased predation. We can also have density-independent factors that can change the population, but it does in a very different way. So density-independent means it has nothing to do with how many of the organisms there are. It's just something that is going to cause the population to grow or contract. So this could be things like a natural disaster, a change in how much sunlight or temperature there's, say through climate change, pollution levels, oxygen levels, things like that are not the, if you will, the fault of the organisms. They didn't make this change happen. This change just happened to them. We call these density independent factors, and they do not produce a logistic curve. Let's take a look. So we have an organism growing at its biotic potential, and there's some sort of population reducing event. I don't know, a forest fire. That's not density dependent, or a disease comes in. All right. What happens is the population will drop, but after that drop, it will begin to go right back to growing at its biotic potential again, because what caused it to drop had nothing to do with how many organisms there are. But if it's density dependent, we get a curve that looks like this one here, this logistic curve. You need to be very familiar with it. So density dependent factors sometimes are called an environmental resistance to growth. Basically, here's what you've got. If there is no environmental resistance, the organism is just going to grow at its biotic potential. So that never can really happen, not for indefinitely. However, when that happens, you get this J-shaped curve, an exponential growth curve. And here we see the dashed line showing this is what it would be if there were no density-dependent factors. There was no environmental resistance to growth. But there always is. This isn't the best drawn graph, unfortunately. But what happens is now we get to a certain point. We'll actually reach an inflection point, which this doesn't really show. But we should have an inflection point, at which point the competition for food, for mates, for shelter, and all these things start to limit growth. And as they limit growth, the growth gets smaller, smaller, smaller until we reach a growth rate of essentially zero. The population stops growing at a certain level. It will become asymptotic to the x-axis at a certain level here. and that is what we're going to call the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is a concept that says, look, because organisms do impose density-dependent limitations to growth, they always will. They will always run out of space. They will always run out of food. You always, in the real world, get population curves that look somewhat like this. They're a little bit more complex than this, but we'll just do this right now. So eventually we get to this inflection point, and from that point onwards, we're no longer growing at or near the biotic potential. We're slowing off, and food is becoming more scarce, and there's more and more competition for mates, so reproduction is happening less. And then we get to this point here where we no longer grow anymore, and we just stay at that point indefinitely unless something changes in the environment. We call this maximum population size the carrying capacity, and it's easy to spot on one of these curves. Now the idea is when we get this, if we actually get to if we don't go beyond this carrying capacity, and the conditions don't change, this population can remain stable like this indefinitely for millions of years. Now that's not usually what happens, but it could happen. So again, let's just dig into this a little bit more. At first, we have a J-shaped curve. That means essentially there's no limitation on growth because there's so much availability of resources. Then we reach the inflection point. At this point, we're starting to have limitations. These limitations place more and more downward pressure on the growth of it until we settle off at a population size that is stable, which is the carrying capacity. Now, let's think of it in terms of birth rate and death rate, all right? So here, birth rate exceeds death rate, so the population grows. At the inflection rate, basically, the birth rate is decreasing, the death rate is increasing, and at this point here, the birth rate and the death rate equal each other, so the population doesn't grow. So if 50 animals are born and 50 die, then the population doesn't change, as long as there's no immigration or emigration. Excuse me for that burp, that's gross. Now, what about if there is a change? Like I said, you could stay at the carrying capacity indefinitely, but what if, I don't know, there's a change? Again, so let's just say there's a deer population that eats 3 different kinds of trees. Well, one of those trees gets diseases and they're just gone. Well, what might happen then is there's going to be a decrease in the population, starvation. Now what happens is things start to starve. Now what happens here is the death rate is higher than the birth rate, so the population is going to decrease. But as that happens, there's a greater availability of resources, so eventually what happens is we settle back off. I drew this myself. How did I do? Not so great here. It looks like it's a little bit bumpy. But what happens is we tend to settle off at a reduced carrying capacity. So the point being that these carrying capacities, they're not a fixed amount. They can change over time depending on changes in the environment. Overshoot's an important concept because this is what really happens, and this is kind of scary from a human perspective, as we'll see in a future lesson. So what often happens is this: you get the population is growing at or near its biotic potential, and it screams upward. Now here's the carrying capacity. This is the maximum that we can support without degrading the environment, but we go right past it because, remember, they're breeding. So when they reach this, they haven't started to have the negative impacts of starvation yet. And so what happens is there's a period of time where the population skyrockets right past where it could have maintained itself. So we get to this point here. Now there's definitely not enough food. So what's going to happen is starvation. And what that means is there's going to be a higher death rate than a birth rate, so the population is going to come back down. As it does, resources become available again, and the population comes back up. So we have this phenomenon called overshoot and dieback. Overshoot just means that the population has grown rapidly and gone right past its carrying capacity. Before we saw that it reached an inflection point. And this often happens, in which case we don't have to worry too much about overshoot. But sometimes that's not what happens. You go right past the carrying capacity, and now you have to have a dieback, and often you get these a series of these overshoots and diebacks whose magnitude diminishes over time until it settles off at the carrying capacity. Let's just do a little bit of math here. You will not have to do math on the test, but it's a good idea to think about this math just so you get a sense of this, okay? So this is the rate of change of the population, all right, over time, the change in numbers over time, all right? And what we find is R is the biotic potential. Remember R selected species? That's where the R comes from. So basically the maximum rate at which the species can reproduce. So R max, we're going to call it, times the number of individuals in the population, that's going to be the slope of this graph. So the bigger the N, the bigger the number of organisms in this population, the faster it's going to change its population size. So this is going to stay constant as this gets bigger, so we get an exponential curve. But over here, we're going to throw another factor in there. So basically, this is still R max times N, R max times N, but now we've got this thrown in there. K is the carrying capacity. Remember K selected species? They tend to stay near their carrying capacity. So K, the carrying capacity, minus N over K times basically this. All right. So what is the rate at which you're going to grow? Well, let's just say your population is very, very small. Well, then what will happen is this approaches 0. So K minus 0 is K over K is 1. So basically, you're just at this and you're going to experience this. That's what we have here when the population is very small. But as this number gets bigger, this starts to become basically smaller than 1, right? So now, instead of it being 1, this is maybe like K minus 0.5. So now let's say this is 0.5. So now we're growing half as fast. And then what happens is when this number here reaches the carrying capacity, at that point, K minus K is 0. So then this whole expression just goes to 0. That means the rate of change is 0, and we stay where we are. So that's the difference between these two. Now, let's think of this in terms of this expression here, K minus N over K. So here, what we find is, well, I just got something from my boyfriend, Rob Paul. He wants me to talk to him, but I got to finish this first. Okay, so what happens here is, at this point, the number of individuals is above the carrying capacity, right? So if this is greater than K, then that means I'm going to have a negative number. That means I'm going to have a negative slope, and so that means my population is going to decrease. Once I'm below the carrying capacity, though, what happens is, now what I have is N is less than K, so this value here is greater than 0, so the population will go up again, so we get a continuous. So the idea is when I have basically N is greater than K, I should expect to get negative slopes, and when N is less than, I should expect to get positive slopes, although it does take time for the changes to occur. Now, another thing we should think about is this special relation between predators and prey. So look what happens. So here's the population of the prey population. It's the food source for the predator. So when there's a lot of prey, there's unlimited resource, so the predator population is close to its biotic potential. But as more and more of them eat, there's fewer and fewer of these here, so their population begins to decline. Well, as their population begins to decline, it's harder for this population to grow, and they reach basically their carrying capacity. But this population has dropped so much that this one actually becomes negative now. They start to die off because there's not enough things to eat. But as they die off, there's less say predators to eat the prey, so the prey population starts going back up. And what happens is, as the prey population starts to go back up, the predator population can go back up because now there's a greater availability of resource, which causes the prey population to decrease. So we see this offset of basically sine waves in predator population and prey population. It makes sense. And now let's just talk about catastrophic collapses. Now, that doesn't sound very good. So overshoot can sometimes be catastrophic and something you can't recover from. So sometimes what we have is overshoot, and then we drop off, and then we have successively smaller amplitude overshoots and die-offs until we stabilize at K. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens is this overshoot is such that the resources that this organism depended on are wiped out, or for whatever reason, this population just completely crashes to a point it can't recover from. And a classic case of this happened on an island in the Aleutians called St. Matthew Island. They put some reindeer there because they thought, oh, you know what, we'll drop some reindeer off on this island. That way, if American troops is during World War II, if they can't get anywhere else, they come here and find something to eat. And they forgot about them. And they went back and they, holy crap, we left 40 reindeer here. Now there's like 6,000 of them. Man, they went right past the camera. What do they eat? They eat lichen because it's a tundra environment. That's about all there is, right? Well, guess what they did? They ate all the lichen. And they ate all the lichen, and all of a sudden there was just no food left. Now, the reindeer just crashed down to almost nothing, and now you've got a bottleneck. And when they went back there, they were all weird, like their antlers were all crooked, and they were genetically messed up because they basically had such a tight bottleneck that the genetic biodiversity of the population just was eliminated, and they just couldn't recover from it. Okay, I'm sorry this one was so long. It's a big topic. It's a cool topic. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.